Hi, I'm Tim, and welcome to Watch You Want. Thanks for logging on. They say in the luxury watch market, Rolex is the gold standard. And if that's the fact, then this Tudor Oyster Prince Submariner 7016 is as good as gold. Created in 1946, Tudor has long been Rolex's sister brand. Not junior brand, not little cousin. In many ways, Tudor is a parallel continuity, a pure tool watch in many cases, designed to use the best elements of Rolex's designs from cases to bracelets, in a watch that is, in every sense, just as practical, just as usable, and just as appealing as a Rolex itself. Now, the Rolex Tudor Submariner, and I do call it the Rolex Tudor Submariner because all over it you see the marks of Rolex, from the 5-point coronet and triple lock crown to the fact that the case back itself boasts Rolex of Geneva, case by Rolex of Geneva, original Oyster. This one's even on a Rolex bracelet, so this is redolent of the famed Geneva manufacturer's signature innovations, including automatic winding, itself popularized in the modern era by Rolex, although this is powered by an ETA movement, and of course the famed Oyster case. Now, in about 1968, the latest version of the Tudor Submariner created an innovation that established the continuity above and beyond the Submariner inspiration on the Rolex side of the house. With the advent of the Snowflake hands and the Snowflake dial, the Tudor Submariner formally emerged from behind the shadow of its elder cousin, and in a lot of ways became a defining watch for the Tudor brand. Not only a defining watch for the Tudor brand, but the Tudor Snowflake Submariner has become a watch that's gone down in military lore as standard issue and many times the personal choice of elite combat swimmers with U.S. Navy UDT and SEAL units, as well as the French Marine Nationale. Now, both services from both nations actually issued the watches, and in other cases, servicemen purchased the watches for their own use during the late 60s, the 70s, and the early 1980s. Now, on the wrist, it sits and it looks with all the presence of a vintage sub. I will get to the Snowflake dial in a moment and call out some of its defining features, but I just want to give you a wrist impression. On my wrist, 6 1/3 inches, 16 centimeters, this Tudor Oyster Prince Submariner looks the business. Realistically, you can see the Rolex pedigree and the Rolex DNA, but the watch has an identity all of its own. As a Tudor, that's where the dial really comes into play, because the Snowflakes have no Submariner equivalent. There is no Rolex dial that looks like this. And the 7016 was the first of the line for the Snowflakes. Now, this model, I should mention, features newer hands, but the dial itself is a rare survivor. Now, on a lot of the 7016s, the dials themselves suffered because Tudors, being priced somewhat lower than Rolex Submariners, were often treated mercilessly, and those that saw any kind of military service, doubly so. But this one has a beautiful original tritium dial with a gorgeous ecru patina that's developed on all of the indexes, especially the oversized indexes at the 4 cardinal points, 12, 3, 6, and 9. It's a gorgeous presentation. And again, the fact that it's tritium signed and original adds a lot of beauty and a lot of value to this model. Now, that Tudor Snowflake heritage is inextricably separated from military lore. Obviously, the Marine Nationale of France was the first to use the watch, but later on, the U.S. Navy SEALs and the now defunct U.S. Navy UDT Underwater Demolition Teams reviewed the watch and approved its use for servicemen, and budgets were actually allocated by the service, the U.S. Navy, to purchase Tudor Oyster Prince Submariners for servicemen. What's interesting is that it's generally accepted that up to the high 700,000s, that's common for Tudor 7016 Submariners on the civilian market. Beyond that point, the only watches that tend to have serial numbers substantially higher than 800,000 tend to be former service units from the U.S. Navy and U.S. UDT. Often those that were purchased by servicemen from unit stores or from base stores with their own money. And this example right here actually has a serial number in the 810,000 range, meaning there's a very good chance that this watch actually has a mil-spec history behind it, perhaps purchased through a Navy Nex at some far-flung duty station by an elite combat swimmer with the Underwater Demolition Teams or the U.S. Navy SEALs. Again, I can't say for certain, but the serial number is highly suggestive, and you never know. That's part of the romance of the watch. Sometimes vintage carries a story that can never be told. but the plausibility of U.S. Navy service time for this watch makes it that much more intriguing, as if the style itself weren't enough. Now, it is the spitting image of the 5513 Submariner, and the bottom line is it has the finer lines of a vintage Submariner. And I want to emphasize that. The older subs sat lower on the wrist. They had less mass on the wrist. There was more of a gradual taper between the lugs and the tapering bracelets themselves. The crown guards were a little bit finer. Today, there's been sort of a disconnect between the size of the Rolex Submariner case and the size of the nominal size, the 40 millimeter measurement of the dial itself at the bezel. And as the lugs have flared and the crown guards have grown, it's lost a little bit of elegance, it's lost a little bit of its versatility. I'm not sure it wears quite as well with the suit as it used to. I'm not sure it feels quite as natural on the wrist as it used to. But with the older Tudor and Rolex Submariners, you get a beautiful on-the-wrist experience. It looks absolutely charming, and it's in great condition with that vintage tritium dial patina. And on the wrist, it looks completely natural with any attire. From the casual to the formal, this is a full-time companion. Now about the movement, it is an ETA 2461 auto winder, and this is absolutely critical because Tudor's identity has been defined by a robust ETA movement on the inside and the Rolex case, aesthetic, bracelet style on the outside. A tremendous value then and now. They've been tested in the absolute toughest of conditions, and they have undoubted authenticity, having been vetted under the absolute most dire circumstances by the most discerning and demanding military personnel. Today, Tudor is hotter than it's ever been. Recently relaunched in the United States, there's been something of a wellspring of demand for vintage Tudor references. As the U.S. markets become formally reacquainted with the brand, there's been a lot of interest in its historic references, and among those, the Snowflake Submariners stand apart. This one's in outstanding condition. It's a phenomenal vintage piece, whether you're just starting in vintage watches or you're looking to add the piece that completes a collection of vintage Rolex, Tudor, or just military divers. The bottom line is that the Tudor Oyster Prince Submariner 7016 Snowflake, available from watchyouwant.com, just might be the watch you want, whether you're into vintage, contemporary, Rolex, Tudor, civilian, military, or just a cool old watch. I have a feeling this 7016 Tudor Snowflake is in fact the watch you want.